Hello, this is SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be part 3 in a series, and this one, Fantastic Beasts and When They Go Mining. So these mythical classical imagery, especially of the cyclops and the griffin, but more specifically their relation to gold and mining. The previous 2 episodes in this series, I was looking at the ancient legends in regards to metalworking gods, their connections to green skin, lameness, and dwarves, seems to be, again, cross time, cross cultures. And then part 2, the how arsenic and copper would relate to this, but now more on gold. But the previous part was parts were mentioning, especially so Hephaestus or Vulcan being one of these lame gods of metalworking, of course related to mining, and how so often he is depicted in classical Greco-Roman legends in regards to the cyclopes, one-eyed giants. So previously was dwarves, lame connections. Now let's look at giants, and specifically griffins and cyclops and how they connect. So again, this classical Hermetic imagery, which full of mathematical, geometric, astronomical information embedded in symbolism, and there we see how again the Cyclops with Hephaestus, again the metalworking gods, mining gods, and even mining again, especially with the 3 Cyclops in classical Greek legends. So the Cyclops hammering with the god Vulcan or Hephaestus in Greek, and how this will connect to legends of the Cyclops. I did one previously, but I included some video footage and it got blocked. But it was based on Adrienne and the first fossil hunters, and how dinosaurs, mammoths, and myth in Greek Roman times, more likely than not, was the inspiration for these fantastic creatures. So ancient miners. So since ancient times, whether it was copper, gold, silver, then later on iron, whatever they were doing, mining was a big industry to equip an army. It was done on industrial scales. De Re Metallica by George Agricole, which is a compendium from the 1500s, late 1400s, but a compendium again of ancient mining knowledge. But it's a technical book rather than one so much into myths and legends. So again, the classical imagery through to the Hermetic, heavily Hermetic period. So what is Hermetic period? I'm really referring to the Middle Ages through to the early Renaissance, when famous Hermeticists, Robert Fludd, alchemists, Kircher, Michael Meyer, etc. But the power of this imagery, and again with the Cyclops, the one-eyed monster, giant, which connects to there. Now, Pliny the Elder, the Natural History, it's a great book in regards to these aspects. He has chapters on mining, the importance of origins, importance mining techniques in regards to gold, but also to copper as well. You can find that books 33 and 34 of the Natural History, especially focus on gold and then copper. But chapter 21, book 33, gold is found in our part of the world, not to mention the gold extracted from the earth in India by the ants, and in Scythia by the Griffins. So India and Scythia. So the Scythians is a broad term that the Greeks used to describe a whole variety of people. There were Sarmatians, Alans, and many other tribes, groups amongst the Scythians. So just to keep that in mind. But gold extracted from the earth in India by the ants, and in Scythia by the Griffins. Okay, so in book 11, chapter 36, when the section on insects and ants, it says, the horns of an Indian ant suspended in the temple of Hercules at Erythrae have been looked upon as quite miraculous for their size. This excavates gold from holes in a country in the north of India, the inhabitants of which are known as the Dai. It has a color. The ant. It is the color of It is the color of a cat, and is in size as large as an Egyptian wolf. The gold which it extracts in the winter is taken by the Indians during the heat of summer, while the ants are compelled by excessive warmth to hide themselves in their holes. Still, however, on being aroused by catching the scent of Indians, they sally forth and frequently tear them to pieces. Though provided with the swiftest camels for the purpose of flight, so great is their fleetness combined with their ferocity and their passion for gold. But he mentions the Temple of Hercules at Erythrae. The horns of an Indian ant suspended in the Temple of Hercules at Erythrae have been looked upon as quite miraculous in their size. Now this will be an important feature. So when dinosaurs, paleontology, we think of it as rather modern, but of course these fossils and fossilized footprints, etc., have been sitting there in the stone and in the earth for a very long time. More recent times, we've become interested in a paleontology sort of aspect, but they've been there, and people would have surely been encountering dinosaur fossils, megafauna fossils, way back in time. And the concept is that this and other temples, places have been mentioned to have fantastic creatures on display in there, and more than likely not they would be fossils. So Erythrae was a colony, most would say was founded by Eryphras, who came from Crete. Now this is along with Cyprus, the copper of Cyprus, Cyprus translating to copper. Crete was also an important place, again mentioned in Pliny, the different mining centres, and how, for instance, the seam of Cypriot copper was exhausted, but then other mining sites popped up around. But Crete as well being very important, the Minoan culture as well. Temple of Knossos in Crete, 14th to 11th century, and again we see griffins there. So again, this griffin imagery goes back quite some time, prior to even the Scythians arriving around about the 9th century BC, but we can see again that this griffin imagery is very old. And a griffin is basically the line of a body with the head of an eagle or a bird. Not to be confused with a griffonic, but we'll come to that anyway. So griffins from Crete up into Erythrae. There's also an animal, the Cretan from Crete, the dwarf mammoth. There's also a Cypriot dwarf mammoth. These they got separated on these islands, and they become dwarves. And they were around up until the so at the end of the Ice Age, these were some of the megafauna which disappeared. So megafauna such as in America, South America, very well known, but there was also lots of megafauna, including woolly mammoths, for instance, in Eurasia, but also down south in the Mediterranean, these dwarf mammoths. There's an example of from Crete, but also from Cyprus. Now they're also to be found in island of Malta, for instance. But in regards to megafauna, so for instance in South America we have this terror bird, and a very good name. Now these go back I think about 1 million years, but the megafauna, even here in Australia we had carnivorous kangaroos, giant wombats the size of Volkswagens, these megafauna that the last of which pretty much got wiped out with the end of the Ice Age. For instance, the moa, these giant birds in New Zealand, this was found, and again internet, aliens and stuff like that. But again, these are, well, that's a good example, because imagine people in the past coming across these. Now, you see on the internet something's found like this, and all sorts of immediate fantastic creatures and beasts or extraterrestrials attached to any find such as this is often the case. Well, this will be a good example of how it was in the past as well. La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, for instance, where they find saber-tooth, these tigers, which some believe were actually their primary food was hominids. They were similar cat because basically the shape of the teeth would perfectly pierce the back of the skull. So they would grab early hominids. Well, in the past there were giant animals that were tailor-made to hunt people like us, animals like us down. But when it comes back to these dwarf mammoths, like they're found in Malta, Crete, and Cyprus. There's a skull, so that would be up to about waist height on a man, a little bit higher, and there we see the skeleton, the skull of one of these finds. This is another angle. See and these are not too different from modern elephant skulls in the way they're shaped. The size is different, of course. It's another dwarf mammoth skull. And here we see some elephant skulls, current day elephants, and might get the connection now between the origins of the cyclopes and these giant cyclopes and skulls such as these being found in the past. Now, elephants were around at the time, but most Greeks would not be familiar with elephants. So even if one was brought to there, or if they found one of those dwarf mammoth skulls, they wouldn't go, oh, open my textbook, oh, that's an elephant skull. They would, what's this creature? This would be as foreign to them as what a kangaroo would be when they were first introduced to Europe. It would be a very exotic, very unusual. For instance, when they first brought the platypus to Europe with the duck-billed platypus, most people thought it was a hoax. Like, what mammal has a duck bill? But that's, again, still, these type of things can freak us out now. For instance, after a big storm on the beach, I found this, and, and I'm not going to lie to you, for a moment we thought we'd stumbled upon something very, very unusual, unknown, and when we took it to the major aquarium here, and they identified it as a leather jacket. So these type of skulls can, again, they get into our imagination and can really get things going. So back to where we see the Mediterranean world, but now we have where is generally referred to as the Scythian Empire region. Again, the Scythians were not a homogeneous group. There are many different tribes, Sarmatians, for instance. Typical image of the Scythians is this fierce, nomadic horsemen. Pliny describes the tribes of the Scythians, which feed upon human flesh. Nations formerly existed with these monstrous propensities for cyclops, and the Lystrigones. Very recently, on the other side of the Alps, it was custom to offer human sacrifices after the manner of these nations. It is the difference is but small between sacrificing humans and eating them. But that goes to the Lystrigones, which is mentioned in the Odyssey, these giants who cannibal giants, and also, of course, the one-eyed cyclops, these giants as well. Reconstructions of Scythian armor, sort of based on the Scythian art itself and finds from Scythian tombs, but the Scythian gold work is, museums love it. It's beautiful gold work, very highly skilled, not much more highly skilled than some fierce, ferocious, unsophisticated nomads, but also that skill in gold also relates to metalwork, for instance, with their scale armor as well. You can look up Scythian gold and even connections to the Golden Fleece with Jason as well, and some interesting ideas on the origins. For instance, the Black Sea, that Jason travelled up to the Black Sea, and there's a part of the world still there in current day Bulgaria where they put a fleece into a river and they use it to catch alluvial gold. And, well, that will turn a fleece into gold, but that's something else. So the Scythians, quite skilled warriors, horsemen, but also very skilled in metallurgy and craft work. I think the Scythians might have even been the inspiration for the sort of those Dothraki horsemen in that Game of Thrones. But if we look, for instance, on this cup and on this, we call it a neck, but what we have are, again, clearly we see griffins. They've got the body, claws of a lion with wings, but the head of an eagle. We see the same with a griffin here. Again, it's not maybe a horse. Looks like, yes, it's attacking a horse there. But the Scythians and griffin connection. So back to Pliny, as he mentions, got the gold extracted in Scythia by the griffins, and these Scythians themselves very into griffins. And Book 7, Chapter 2, in the vicinity also of those who dwell in the northern regions, not far from the spot where the north wind arises. So Boreas, as in the boreal regions, and the north wind of the 8 winds in Greece. Boreas was the north wind. It even speaks of a cave, so that would be an important feature. But the Arimaspi are said to exist, whom I have previously mentioned, a nation remarkable for having but one eye, and that placed in the middle of their forehead. So again, these cyclopes imagery. The race is said to carry on a perpetual warfare with the griffins, a kind of monster with wings, as they are commonly represented, for the gold which they dig out of the mines, and which these wild beasts retain and keep watch over in a singular degree of cupidity, while the Arimaspi are equally desirous to get possession of it. So the griffins, northern Scythia, are from the north winds there, but also the concept of the griffins not just digging up the gold, for which they keep watch over with a singular degree of cupidity. So the concept also of griffins as guardians, which is a very important one in regards to, so up there in the north, and the cyclops, Arimaspi, and the griffins, very interested fighting over gold. Again, I'd refer to Adrienne. So this is some old Greek imagery, and they're seeing this attacking this monster, but it looks more like a skull than a living beast. Now that would be an interesting feature. So if we think about mining, they're digging down into the ground. Miners would be more likely of any particular trade or profession to come across as they're digging to find fossils and bones. And hey Bob, remember when you said things about monsters being a bunch of old superstitions? Well, this connection between these mythical beasts, protecting gold, protecting the mines as well, would be a fairly evident one. So ancient miners perfectly placed to uncover fossils, and they would have been finding things like this, and more than anyone else, they would have been the people exposed to creatures like this. So mythical monsters found guarding the precious metals such as gold. So when they're digging, they're going to be coming across the fossils, and then the association between gold mines, that's where they're digging, but so they wouldn't be digging some random place to dig a shaft, so they probably would have found fossils there as well. But the connection between these type of fossils, which will resemble these mythical creatures and mining, and the concept of griffins guarding these places. So, where we find gold, we find these monsters, and then again that association. So in ancient temples, more often than not, were also treasury buildings, and so they'd have a false floor, and there they would keep the treasure. There's guards there, etc. It's a safe place to keep. And the decorations of this is Temple of Antonius and Faustina in Rome, again with the griffin imagery, griffins on coins. Temple of Gnosis in Crete, in Didyma, across all the ancient world, you'll find these links between griffins and fossils. And similar to a Greek sphinx, it tends to be a guardian, and they tended to have wings, unlike the Egyptian sphinxes. Greek sphinxes would also be winged creatures, and so a lion's body with wings and a human head. So again, like a griffin and Greek sphinxes can be connected. Persia as well, really all across the um, ancient world, from the Mediterranean across to India. So Apollo riding a griffin, these connections between Griffins and Apollo on the griffin, and also you'll notice Griffins there with the lyre of Apollo. And for instance, in Sanchi Stupa, which has many Greek, what they call Greco-Buddhist architecture, lots of it in there in Sanchi Stupa, but of course they also have the griffins, so the wings, the eagle's beak, and the lion's body, a guardian, especially over temple sites. Byzantines and as well, this was the Venetians brought, okay, but again, griffins as guardians. In Burma, so even in Buddhists as well, will feature these griffins as guardians again, as opposed to a griffonic. This is here in Sydney, where we have, it's a winged lioness and two of them, so one guarding each side. There's this she guardian in London, which is the same thing. It's a lioness and wings. These are what's called the griffonic. So a griffin should have a bird's head, but griffins, griffonics, they're all essentially guardians of major temples, for instance, here in the Altar of Peace in Rome. But griffins mining and guarding gold. So whether it's the mine or whether it says griffins mining the gold, griffins guarding the mines, griffins guarding the gold once it's been excavated. Cyclopes, at constant war with the griffins, fighting over gold. Also the Cyclopean giant connection with metalworking, going through into the Hellenistic and later period, and still in resonating with later imagery. So dinosaur skulls such as these, very strong argument for the origins of the griffins, while mammoths, elephants, and being a very strong connection to the origins of the cyclops. And so again, just like with now, people see a strange skull or animal, the imagination runs wild, and certainly was no different back then. Earlier sort of mentioned as well, as Pliny mentions, gold extracted from the earth in India by the ants, in Scythia by the griffins. So he also mentions the horns of an Indian ant suspended in the temple of Hercules at Erythrae, looked upon as quite miraculous for their size. It has the color of a cat, and is the size as large as an Egyptian wolf. So giant ants, mining and excavation. Again, fossils would possibly point to a origin for these. This type of fossil, has that resemblance with the ant and those giant horns, or even another one of the megafauna, from the Ice Age, died out with the Ice Age. It was Uryx as well, but the steppe bison, having these similarities to giant ants as well. So get these old fossils, bones could, something like this, especially a giant, because it's very similar to a cow skull, but a cow skull bull is smaller, the horns are a little bit different too. But when you have a giant one, this would be, these connections could have been drawn in the past. In regards to griffins and ants and also metallurgy, I'd like to recommend the channel 9th Heretic, especially these videos, ants, griffins and gold. And as she looks into she's also done a whole series on mounds and termites, how they would connect. But now, for instance, in regards to termites and ants, they dig down into the ground and then they bring up samples of the soil from deep down, which would allow a prospector to get a good idea of the minerals that are below the soil. This being one of the possible connections between ants and mining, also with termites and mining as well. But also metal workers would make a furnace using the mud from termite mounds, ant mines as well, because of the particular qualities of those features as well. So, for instance, how to make a furnace using that mud, but also the various from Africa across to India, the connections that these people draw between termites and ant mounds as well, in a mythical sense, but also their practical applications and connections that can be made from there as well. So I'll link these videos in there. Worth subbing to the channel and looking through. Some very interesting stuff indeed. So fantastic beasts and where they go mining, griffins, ants, and cyclopes joined to, especially to gold in this, as is mentioned. I was referring to Pliny throughout this, but in Pliny he's referring to even older writers and travellers as well. So hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. There will be links to the previous 2 episodes in the description. Also links to the ants, griffins videos by the 9th Heretic channel. Thank you for watching and have a good one.